Anytime you look at the back or the bottom of any product in your home, you're going to find the words Made in China on it. These three words have become synonymous with manufacturing. When you see the words Made in China, the image that comes to mind is cheap, affordable goods. One thing that does not come to mind is quality. Since the restoration of capitalism in China, production for foreign purchase has been dominated by what are known as OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, meaning that they manufacture parts for foreign brands. Doing this concentrates the profits not even really in the hands of the bourgeoisie in China, but in the hands of the first world bourgeoisie. They can be from anywhere, America, Europe, or Japan. As the RMB, the Chinese currency, appreciates, it increases the cost of manufacturing, causing a decrease in demand from foreign businesses. This often causes them to seek out a cheaper source of labor like Vietnam. The necessity here is to preserve jobs and the economy within the context of capitalism. It's to develop brand names to sell to the world. Each nation, in some form or another, has some kind of well-known brand name. America has Apple, Japan has Sony, South Korea has Samsung. To date, no such major brand name has emerged from China to compete in the global market. Now, there are some good reasons why this has happened. One reason is that China has built its capitalism on being a cheap labor pool. The price advantage in labor has attracted other capitalists in China to do the same. Being a cheap pool of labor as opposed to being an innovator has more of an incentive to manufacturers. The instant gains with seeing little cost to just pump out cheap goods for immediate demand has been more attractive to capitalists than brand building domestically for foreign purchase. Doing so would require a great deal more of investment capital, hiring and giving time to designers to create new innovative products. There would be no immediate returns, as it would be a new product, and building a brand name alone is a massive undertaking. The market in this case has not been an engine of innovation. It has in fact been a tremendous hindrance. Another major hurdle for the establishment of a Chinese brand would be overcoming a suspicion of quality. The term Made in China, as I said earlier, is synonymous with frugality in manufacture. Here it's important to remember the history of the rise of Japanese manufacturing. 40 to 50 years ago, when Japanese products first arrived in the Western markets, their quality was suspect. Recognizing that suspicion, the Japanese manufacturers spent day and night sparing little cost and quality control. This tremendous emphasis on quality is what gave rise to the Japanese imports of everything in the 1980s. The Japanese themselves became synonymous with quality. This mentality gave rise to the brands that we have now, well established, like Honda and Sony. We have to remember, at this time in the 80s, the Japanese were innovating products and in the very operation of business itself. I can even remember statements by corporate elites in the US in those days talking about making it mandatory for their CEOs and partners to learn Japanese, because there was this prevailing feeling that the Japanese were going to take over the entire business world. Of course, we know in hindsight that's not what happened. I have little doubt that the Chinese will not learn from these mistakes. Westerners may say bad things about the Chinese, but stupid is not one of them. Domestically, Chinese brands can be competitive in the local market. There's no shortage of labor, innovative thinkers, or managers who can put things into motion. The international market, however, is a completely different situation. In terms of experience, China has very little brand building internationally. China has a great deal of experience in other fields when doing business overseas. Giving out cheap loans to businesses and governments is one, but that's relatively easy. Hey, here's cheap loans. You want it? They're also quite experienced in getting contracts from foreign firms to purchase a single or multiple components for a foreign brand. Again, an easy sell. Hey, want the same thing you have now, 1/10 the cost? Chinese businesses have little or no experience in selling their own goods in the international market. The Chinese are good at selling their products to foreign firms, not to foreign customers. The beginning here is for China to build its own brands domestically first. It has a great potential to do so, as there is a huge domestic market, an advantage that many now international brands had during their inception. The process of doing so will educate those in the brand business community on how to build brands. At least it will give them an education in the fundamentals. Once a domestic national has been established and solidified with a few years' experience, the profits from those years can be put towards establishing brand recognition in foreign, even international markets. This would itself be a tremendously expensive endeavor, one that would have to be undertaken by a brand that had capital built up domestically first. This development would not only provide the funds necessary, it would also provide the necessary experience to those responsible for its future foreign undertakings. Establishing brands internationally and increasing them domestically will end up being an absolute necessity. Right now, China is the world's pool of cheap labor, the world's factory. However, this position in the world's economy cannot, it will not last. Capitalism always strives to find a cheaper source of labor in order to extract greater and greater profits. They have to do so in order to compete with other capitalists. Vietnam is already a good source for cheap labor than China. Not to mention what is going to happen when Africa finally gets opened up to the world market. When this inevitability occurs, the Chinese economy will have to reorientate itself in a new direction if it is not to fall into disaster. It will be imperative that they begin investing in a knowledge economy, a major focus of investment dollars as it pertains to manufacturing. It will have to be in the research and development sector, a point the true potential of Chinese developers and innovative thinkers can finally step forward as the market will make it necessary for them to do so. Ironically, the same market stifles creativity and innovation in favor of the more profitable investment in manufacturing cheap components. This change will be taking place sooner or later, will probably be within the next 15 to 20 years. This will give China what's known as a first world economy, meaning the shift will gradually move away from domestic manufacturing. And truly, manufacturing simply could not cease in China the way it has here in the West. The sheer population density would make it impossible for any collection of nations to keep the supply of goods up with the demand of China. Even with that lesser degree of a shift away from manufacturing, a first world mall economy, as described by Maoist third worldists, would begin to take form. This mall aspect of the Chinese economy will have the same negative repercussions that they've had here. Only time will tell to what degree. Some economists in China are saying that it is necessary for China to start opening up their economy to the luxury brands of goods from foreign sources. The idea is that this would help balance out trade and will at the same time teach Chinese consumers to consume. The fact is, Chinese consumers still have some of the anti-materialistic consciousness left over from communism still lingering around. Now, this has a tendency to manifest itself in a kind of inner shame, as they call it, that discourages many from purchasing the higher end of luxury goods. I personally don't find this to be at all effective in leveling out trade imbalances. Purchasing a dozen or so Boeing 747s or tons of precious metals or electrical machinery would have a much larger effect. Luxury brands, in my opinion, would do little in terms of balancing out trade with Europe and the United States. I think having a domestic manufacturing of luxury goods filling a domestic demand would be far wiser. For example, as I previously said, it would help brand establishment in China, building up enough capital to begin marketing itself overseas. One thing that a few economists in China and internationally have noted is that China has a chance to really get into the airframe manufacturing market internationally. Right now, large-scale commercial plane manufacturing is dominated by Airbus and Boeing, manufacturers of smaller aircraft like Embraer in Brazil and Bombardier in Canada. Bombardier produces a large range of regional and business aircraft, including the Learjet. Bombardier found its niche market with those types of airframes. What is possible for China to do is find its own niche market, produce something that is in demand, or innovate something and create a new niche. For China, this task would have to be original, superior, and good value for the customer. This niche, whatever it would end up being, would have to be sustainable as well. And despite all of this, right now the main thing to do would be to develop brands domestically to increase not only consumption of these goods in the anticipation of the day when China is no longer the world's cheap factory labor. The problem right now in doing so is that those with enough money now seeking to purchase higher end brands of products tend heavily towards foreign brands. The reason being is that the Chinese know the stuff they make is of much lower quality. As a result of this, there has been many Chinese manufacturers domestically that have been giving their products similar names and appearances to well-established products known to be of high quality. While we here in the West don't see those products as much, people in China are far more familiar with them. On a personal note, I've always found this phenomenon to be quite humorous. Essentially, capitalists ripping off other capitalists while screaming the free market is how they create originality. Here I see a tremendous irony. Companies here in the West have goods manufactured in China and find all kinds of loopholes to make it seem like the product was made here. Some examples of this are how anything made in Saipan can legally be called made in America. China created a manufacturing town called USA. Of course, this is spelled USA, so where the product is required to label its point of manufacture, it appears as though it was made in USA. My favorite example of this was a Canadian company making apple juice with Chinese apples, but labeled Product of Canada. Legally, 51% of the manufacturing costs must be domestic in order for the product to be labeled Product of Canada. The cost of apples in the juice was less than the cost of the bottle and the label. In China, they do the opposite. Domestic manufacturers go to good lengths to make it appear as though their products come from outside the country. This is so perfectly ironic coming from capitalism. Markets always supposedly equate freedom and the freedom to choose, and that the free market will create an informed consumer to make choices. Yet we see in practice the exact opposite. The capitalist is always trying to portray his products as something they are not. Essentially, they're being dishonest when the market dictates that such behavior is not only counter to the concept of a free market, but it would be eliminated by the market. It's only when the state intervenes that we get laws that force these companies to reveal where they come from, despite all the loopholes these manufacturers demand. To build domestic brands that can compete with the international brands which now dominate the Chinese market, there are a few things the manufacturers need to do first. First, they must overcome the perception of the domestic brands being of low quality. It is of the utmost imperative right now that they hype focus on quality following the experience of the Japanese companies in the past. Next would be a brand image, building up how the consumer public sees the product. The immediate, easy thing to do would be to play to patriotic sentiment. China is a very nationalist place. The identity of the nation is a very strong image in their minds. Now, I do not think that it would be difficult to establish such a brand with blatant flag waving. Such a nationalist branding has been extremely successful in the West as well as Europe and Japan. All three regions have their iconic beer that's tied to their national identity. Molson Canadian is a good example, even though it's actually jointly owned by an American company and a Brazilian company. General Motors is an iconically American brand of automobiles, and it's been so for decades. In the UK, you have Admiral Sportswear and Bentley, for example. This greater building of brands inside China is of the utmost importance when considering the future of Chinese manufacturing. It has to grab a hold of the domestic market and take away at least some of the grip foreign brands have if they're to remain stable and profitable through all the changes that will be taking place in the next 20 years or so.